runaway bride begs for bread. A stranger changes her fate. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. They said winter had a way of grinding men down until only the bone was left. In Frost Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1877, that winter was sharper than most. Snow smothered the streets in silence, muffling wagon wheels weighing down roofs and pressing against the lungs of anyone who dared step outside. The sky itself seemed to sag gray and unrelenting, as if it wanted to crush the town flat. Colton Hayes rode into Frost Hollow alone, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. 34 years old, he looked as though he'd been carved from the same wind and dust that shaped the plains, broad-shouldered, hollow-eyed, with lines carved deep around his mouth. He had lived the last 5 winters in a cabin he built with his own hands up in the high country, a place where silence pressed close enough to choke a man if he didn't find something to hold on to. He came down to town only when the pantry ran low or when the solitude dug too deep into his bones. That morning he needed salt ammunition and maybe a bottle of whiskey. He dismounted outside the general store and was just reaching for the door when a scent broke through the bitter air. Bread. Fresh, warm, sweet. It poured from the bakery down the street, a reminder that somewhere life still managed to hold a little kindness. Colton turned toward it, drawn more by instinct than hunger. But before he could push open the bakery door, something in the snow caught his eye. Kneeling beside the refuse barrel was a woman. Her dress had once been fine lace at the sleeves, careful stitching along the seams, but it was little more than rags, now thin, fabric torn and stained. She had no gloves, her bare hands raw and red from cold. Her cheeks were sunken lips cracked. She dug through the barrel with trembling fingers and pulled out half a discarded roll, its crust gray with ash. She pressed it to her mouth as though it were a miracle. The bakery door burst open. The baker's wife stormed out, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Get away from there begging like some stray dog, filthy runaway. You've got nerve showing your face here." She raised a broom, swatting at the air as if to drive the girl away. The young woman stumbled back, clutching the crust to her chest. Colton stepped forward, his frame blocking the wind. His eyes fixed on the girl, wide, frightened, and yet somehow proud. He turned from her and pushed into the bakery, where the heat from the ovens nearly stung after the cold outside. "One fresh loaf," he said, voice low and even. The baker's wife narrowed her eyes, muttered under her breath, but handed it over. Colton paid without another word and stepped back into the snow. The girl was still there, shivering, clutching her half-burned crust. Colton crouched in front of her and held out the fresh loaf. Steam still rose from its golden crust. "A lady shouldn't ever have to beg for bread," he said. For a moment she didn't move, as though she wasn't sure if the bread was real or some cruel trick. Then slowly she reached for it, her fingers brushing his glove. "I thank you," she whispered, voice raw. "I didn't mean to." "Eat," he said simply. She broke the loaf in her hands, biting into it with a sound that was half sob, half relief. Crumbs clung to her lips as her hands shook. She ate as though every bite might be stolen. From the doorway, the baker's wife sneered. "That's the runaway bride, Evelyn Hart. Left her groom standing at the altar and stole his family's jewels. Ran from the Abel wedding like a thief in the night." The girl froze mid-bite, her jaw tight. Colton's gaze flicked back to her. "That true?" She lowered the bread. Snow clung to her lashes as she looked at him. "My name is Evelyn," she said softly. "I was meant to marry Victor Ashford. But I ran, that's all." Colton studied her face, haunted yes, but not broken. "That your business or mine?" She blinked confused. "I suppose not." He nodded once, as though that settled it. Behind them, the wind rose cruel again, slicing down the street. Evelyn clutched the loaf close her teeth, chattering now that her hands were free. "You got somewhere warm tonight?" Colton asked. Her eyes dropped. "Just behind the saloon. They let me stay by the stables if I keep quiet." Colton reached into his coat, unwound the scarf from his own neck, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool smelled of pine smoke and horse saddle. She gasped at the sudden warmth. "I'll be back before sundown," he said simply. "Don't go too far." And with that, he mounted his horse and rode off into the white haze. Evelyn stood in the snow, half-eaten bread in her hand, scarf pulled tight. For the first time in weeks, her breath didn't ache in her chest. For the first time since she'd fled, someone had looked at her not with disgust or greed, but with a kind of quiet mercy. She finished the loaf slowly, each bite deliberate, as though it might be the last thing she would ever taste. Then she sank into the shadows behind the saloon, scarf clutched close, rocking herself against the cold. The world around her still scorned and whispered, but something small had shifted. A stranger had seen her worth, and that fragile spark was enough to keep her alive until morning. The wind howled down, frost hollows, narrow alleys, like a wounded thing, sharp and merciless. Behind the saloon, Evelyn's heart curled in the narrow gap between the feed room and a broken stretch of fence. The ground was frozen hard as stone, the timber wall behind her, leeching away what little heat her body still carried. She pulled Colton Hayes' scarf higher around her face, burying her nose in the wool. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and it was the only reminder that someone had seen her as more than trash that day. No one spoke to her directly as night fell, but plenty spoke about her. "That's the runaway from the Ashford wedding," muttered a man near the general store, voice thick with judgment. "Stole a brooch worth more than this whole town." A woman scoffed, "Just another spoiled daughter playing poor for sympathy." Someone else spat tobacco into the snow. "There's a bounty on her, dead or alive." Evelyn had learned to fold herself into silence, to vanish even while standing in plain sight. She drew her knees tighter, pressing her hands between her legs for warmth, and waited for the night to pass. It was near midnight when she heard its steady footsteps, measured, deliberate. Evelyn's heart jumped. She reached under the hay for the jagged slat of wood. She had hidden her only defense. The figure that emerged from the shadows made her freeze. Colton. His hat was pulled low, snow dust in his coat. In his arms he carried a folded wool blanket, thick and worn. In one gloved hand, a simple hunting knife with an iron handle glinted faintly in the moonlight. Without a word, he knelt and draped the blanket over her shoulders. Then he placed the knife by her boot. "Might help you sleep easier," he said quietly. Evelyn's throat closed. She stared at the blade, then back at him. "Why," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not livestock," he answered simply. "You don't deserve to freeze like one." Her chest tightened. The dam inside her cracked, and tears came hot, unstoppable, not from hunger or fear, but because someone had finally seen her. Not a fugitive, not a thief, not a runaway bride. A woman. Colton didn't press her. He just gave a final nod, turned and walked back into the snowfall until he disappeared. Evelyn clutched the blanket to her chest, rocking slowly as the tears streamed. For the first time since she fled, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever: dignity. The morning was pale and windless. Smoke lifted from chimneys. Boots crunched over frost wagons creaked along the frozen road. Evelyn stirred from her corner, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. The knife rested at her side, still untouched but heavy with meaning. Colton stood outside the feed room with 2 horses saddled waiting. "You ready to leave this place?" he asked, his voice calm, not demanding. Evelyn's lips parted, uncertain. "Where would I go?" "My place," he said. "Quiet, plenty of room. No one there but me, a few hens in the land." Her eyes narrowed. "You're not worried what people will say?" "I stopped caring about people's talk years ago." The truth in his voice left no space for doubt. Evelyn searched his face for deceit, but all she saw was steadiness, and so without another word she stepped forward. They rode out just after sunrise. Frost clung to the grass, horses' breath steaming in the cold. For miles they said nothing, but the silence between them was different than the one she'd known before. It wasn't the silence of exile. It was something softer, something that felt in its own way safe. At last, Evelyn broke it. "I wasn't always running," she said, her voice barely above the crunch of hooves. "My family, we once had land in Georgia, columns of piano in the parlor. Then the war came. Father returned, bitter, broken. Our money gone. Pride all he had left." Colton didn't turn his head, but he listened. "He sold me into a marriage with Victor Ashford." She continued, swallowing hard. "Northern money, Southern cruelty. I knew something was wrong the moment I met him. The way he looked at me like stock. Worse, the way he treated the servants." Her voice shook. "I found one crying in the pantry. He'd left bruises." "What did you do?" Colton asked quietly. "I told my father. He said we should be grateful, that girls like her should know their place." Evelyn's lip trembled. "When I told Victor I wouldn't marry a man who beat women, he laughed. Said if I refused him, he'd call me a thief. That the locket I'd worn since I was 12, the shawl from my mother, even the brooch she left me, he'd claim it all as his gifts. That if I ran, I'd be branded a criminal." Colton's jaw shifted, but he said nothing. "So I ran," she whispered. "I took only what was mine, and now there's a bounty on my head." They reached a ridge overlooking a valley blanketed in white. Evelyn pulled her horse to a halt and turned to him. "You can turn back. I won't blame you. It's not your burden." Colton dismounted without a word. He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag, handed it to her, and stood looking out at the endless stretch of hills. Finally he spoke. "If that's a crime," he said, voice steady as stone, "then every woman with a backbone belongs behind bars." Evelyn blinked, her breath catching. A sound left her throat, half disbelief, half laughter, half something dangerously close to hope. Colton glanced at her, the faintest flicker of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "We're not going back," he added. "Not unless you want to." Evelyn tightened her grip on the canteen. Her voice was soft but certain. "I want to go forward." Colton gave a single nod. "Then forward it is." And with that they rode on into the mist, leaving behind the whispers of Frost Hollow and the ghosts of chains. Ahead lay the high country, a place where pasts weren't erased, but maybe, just maybe, they could be outrun. The road to the high country was not kind. Snow drifted in uneven banks, the air thinned, and the horses' hooves sank deep into frozen ground. Yet for Evelyn Hart, the miles carried a strange relief. Each hoofbeat placed distance between her and the posters that branded her a thief, between her and Victor Ashford's looming shadow. By the third day, Colton Hayes's homestead came into view, a small cabin of pine logs, smoke trailing from a stone chimney surrounded by a split-rail fence that sagged in places. Beyond it stretched open land, white and vast, broken only by stands of fir and the shimmer of ice on the creek. It was humble weather beaten, but solid. "This is it," Colton said, as he dismounted, his voice even. He led his horse to the hitching post and waited for her. Evelyn slid stiffly from her saddle legs, trembling from the long ride. She followed him to the porch. He pushed open the door with a creak, and the smell of wood smoke wrapped around her. Life at the homestead unfolded without ceremony. Colton rose before dawn to chop wood feed. The hens mend whatever needed mending. Evelyn did not ask to help, but he began handing her small tasks as if it were natural. She hauled water from the creek, learned how to coax a fire that wouldn't choke the cabin with smoke-scrubbed clothes until her fingers stung. There was no ridicule when she faltered. When she burned the first pan of cornbread, he poured her a glass of milk and said simply, "Try again." When she stumbled while balancing a heavy bucket, he appeared at her side and took the handle without a word. The silence between them grew companionable. It wasn't the silence of strangers or the silence of judgment. It was the quiet of two people learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. By the second week, Colton placed a rifle in her hands. Evelyn's breath hitched. She had never held a gun before, the weight foreign and frightening. "Just in case," he said evenly, "you're not trying to kill, you're trying to survive." Her fingers trembled as she raised it. Colton stepped behind her, steadying her shoulders, adjusting her grip with calloused hands. He didn't crowd her, didn't speak more than needed. His presence alone steadied her. She fired once, the recoil jar in her arms, the shot kicking snow from a distant log. She exhaled shakily, but a faint spark of pride lit her eyes. Then came the fever. It started with a chill that she blamed on the draft through the shutters. By nightfall, she was shivering uncontrollably, sweat soaking her dress, her breath shallow. Colton found her curled on the bed, her skin flushed hot as fire. He didn't hesitate. He fetched a basin of water, soaked a cloth, and pressed it to her forehead. He built the fire higher, sat beside her, and held her hand between his rubbing warmth into her cold fingers. Through the long hours, he did not leave. When she whimpered, he coaxed her to sip water. When her breath quickened, he whispered low, steady words she couldn't understand, but felt nonetheless. At one point, he reached for a tattered book of poems from the shelf. His voice was rough as he read aloud, but the words carried care. "And though the night be cold and long, I'll wait until you find your song." He read until the lamp oil ran low, then simply sat there watching her face, listening to each ragged breath, praying silently. By dawn, the fever broke. Light spilled through the cracked shutters, painting gold across the floorboards. Evelyn opened her eyes slowly. The first thing she saw was Colton slumped in a chair beside her head, tilted hands still clasping hers. Their fingers were laced together, not out of duty, not from necessity, but because at some point in the night he had reached for her and not let go. Her lips parted. She said nothing, but something warm pressed behind her ribs, more than relief, deeper than gratitude. Snow piled thick on the rooftops as the season deepened. Evelyn was peeling potatoes by the hearth one late afternoon when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. She stiffened, knife slipping from her hand. Colton rose, immediately motioned for her to stay back, and stepped onto the porch. A man sat astride a black gelding, his coat frosted from a long ride, a rifle slung across his back. His eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "You Colton Hayes?" the man asked. Colton's stance was steady. "Who's asking?" The rider pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Ethan Cole, bounty hunter, here on lawful grounds." Colton unfolded the paper. Evelyn hovered in the shadows just inside the door, her stomach twisting. The words were stark and damning. Wanted Evelyn Hart, theft of dowry goods, absconding from legal engagement, reward $2,000, authorized by Victor Ashford, Georgia. Colton folded the notice carefully, like it was a snake he wouldn't let bite. "She's not here," he said. Cole's brow arched. "You sure?" "She was," Colton replied. "Came through sick and half dead. I gave her food and fire. She left 2 mornings back." "You let a wanted fugitive walk." "I let a woman walk. If she was anything else, I didn't see it." Cole's gaze hardened. "Mind if I check your cabin?" Colton didn't move. "I do." The air snapped tight, brittle with tension. After a long beat, Cole clicked his tongue and tugged his reins. "If she comes back and you're found harboring her, you'll answer for it." Colton's eyes stayed steady. "I understand more than you think." The bounty hunter turned hoarse, kicking up snow as he disappeared into the trees. Colton stepped back inside. The room was empty. Evelyn was gone. Her tracks led from the porch, small prints pressed into the snow, weaving toward the canyon path. Colton's jaw set hard. He saddled his horse and followed, riding fast as dusk bled across the sky. He found her huddled beneath a rock overhang, coat pulled tight, face pale with fear and cold. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, tears brimming. "I shouldn't have let you go," he answered. His voice was low, steady. "I couldn't let him drag you into this." "I'm already in it," she said, broken. Her eyes lifted to his. "I am not worth the trouble, Colton." He dropped to his knees in the snow before her, took her shaking hands in his. His voice was quiet but firm, every word carrying weight. "I don't need your innocence, Evelyn. I just want your presence." The words hung in the canyon air like a vow. Not loud, not showy, just truth. Her breath caught. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't look away. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Colton's hand squeezed hers. "I've lived with silence for so long. With you it's still quiet, but it feels alive." Her forehead fell against his chest, shoulders shaking. He held her there, against the cold, against the fear, against every lie that said she was unworthy. That night they rode back together. No papers, no promises. Just a man who had chosen and a woman who, for the first time, dared to believe she was worth the choice. Word in Frost Hollow traveled faster than any rider. By the end of the week, bounty posters had appeared on the general store's window, the saloon's wall, even the church notice board. Evelyn Hart's name was etched in bold, the price beneath it, enough to make men salivate. $2,000 could buy a herd, a parcel of land, or a lifetime of whiskey. She moved carefully through the days at Colton's homestead, her shoulders bent under the invisible weight of accusation. She cooked, mended, fed the animals, but her eyes never lingered on the windows. When Colton suggested riding into town together for supplies, she shook her head quickly. "If I show my face, I'll bring trouble." "You think you don't already?" Colton asked gently. Her voice broke. "You could lose everything for me." He set his coffee cup down with deliberate calm. "It's not too much. But the way they look at you now," she set her throat tight. "Like you're compromised, like you've been tainted by me." He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You think I live for their glances. They weren't there when you stitched my coat by lamplight. They didn't see you nurse that colt through the night when it near died. They didn't see you haul water with bleeding hands. You've stood beside life and death and chose to stay. That's worth more than every whisper in Frost Hollow." Her eyes filled though she blinked the tears away. The truth of his words sank into her bones, but fear still clung to her like frost. Saturday came, and with it the weekly market. The square was crowded with ranchers, shopkeepers, widows selling pies, children darting between stalls. Yet beneath the bustle hung a heavy tension. Copies of Evelyn's poster fluttered in the wind, nailed to posts and walls. Men spat tobacco and pointed. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Sheriff Dobson stood near the saloon hat, low jaw tight. The mayor was there too, as was Reverend Matthews, his hands folded on the head of his cane. Then Colton rode in. His pace was steady, his shoulders squared. He dismounted in the center of the square, pulled the poster from his coat, and held it aloft. The chatter died instantly. "You've all seen this," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But it isn't the truth." He let the silence stretch before continuing. "This paper says Evelyn Hart is a thief, that she ran from a wedding with jewels that weren't hers. But I've lived with her under my roof, and I'll tell you what I've seen. She's a woman who's fought harder for survival than most men ever will. She ran from a marriage that would have broken her spirit or worse. She didn't run from shame. She ran to survive." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Colton turned slowly, meeting eyes one by one. "You want to know who Evelyn is? She's the one who stitched my coat through a blizzard. The one who faced fever and clawed her way back. The one who stood in snow with nothing but pride when the rest of you would have bent. I don't know about you, but I've lived in this territory long enough to tell a coward from the brave. Evelyn is brave. She is honest. She is my choice." The words struck the square like a hammer. For a long moment no one moved. Then from near the front a woman's voice rose clear. Mrs. Delaney, the apothecary widow, stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly. "He's right," she said. "That girl saved my Clara years ago when fever near took her. Sat by her bed all night, read psalms, mixed herbs when no doctor was around. My daughter lived because of her. You can say what you want about posters, but that's what I remember." The Reverend shifted, leaning heavily on his cane. "I've sent a letter to the judge in Cheyenne. I cannot speak for the law, but I can speak for character. And hers is not criminal. It is redeeming." Another voice joined a farmer at the edge of the square. "She taught my boy his letters after Sunday service. Wouldn't take a dime for it." A ranch hand added, "She cleaned graves when no one else bothered." One by one, voices rose, not in scorn, but in defense. Men and women who had once looked away now stood taller, speaking aloud the kindnesses Evelyn had left, scattered through their lives like seeds. Sheriff Dobson pulled the poster from Colton's hands. He looked at it, then tore it in two. His voice was low but clear. "I reckon this town's made its decision. I'll send word to Cheyenne. Tell them Frost Hollow's not harboring a criminal. We're protecting one of our own." Colton gave a single nod, nothing more. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode out slow, the weight of 100 eyes on his back. From behind the blacksmith's hall, Evelyn watched. Her hands pressed to her chest, her breath caught between sob and prayer. She hadn't stepped into the square, hadn't dared, but she had heard it all. She was no longer a ghost, no longer just a name on a poster. She was someone worth defending, someone who belonged. For the first time since the night she fled, Evelyn let herself believe perhaps her story wasn't ending in shame. Perhaps it was just beginning. Spring crept into Frost Hollow with a gentleness that felt almost impossible after the long, brutal winter. Snowmelt trickled into the creek, and wildflowers pushed through thawing soil, primrose paintbrush, and daisy painting the valley in quiet defiance. The Hayes homestead softened too. The porch creaked less in the warmer air, and the hens pecked busily in the yard. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the field, one morning apron fluttering in the breeze, her fingers tracing the crown of a hawthorn tree just beginning to bloom. Behind her, simple chairs had been arranged in a crescent on the soft grass. No grand decorations, no organ or choir. Only a stack of stones forming a modest altar, the sound of birdsong in the branches, and a handful of townsfolk who mattered enough to be there. Mrs. Delaney sat in the front row with her daughter's small hand tucked into her own. Reverend Matthews stood at the altar Bible beneath his arm, the lines on his face deeper than the furrows in the earth. The blacksmith, the stable boy, the widow who once offered Evelyn an apple, neighbors not strangers, waited quietly. Colton Hayes stood before them, boots dusted, but his cleanest shirt pressed. He didn't need gold or polish, he was steady, real exactly as he was. And Evelyn, her hair braided low, her mother's cotton dress falling simple and true around her frame, walked toward him with a single wild daisy tucked behind her ear. The world hushed as their eyes met. The weight of her past, of every whisper and every night of hunger, fell away with each step. Reverend Matthews opened his Bible, but his voice was softer than usual. We gather today not to erase the past, but to mark the beginning of something chosen, something true. He looked between them. Do you speak your vows freely? Colton's voice, low and rough, carried steady, I do. Evelyn's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. I do. Then speak your hearts, the Reverend said, stepping back. Colton pulled a slip of paper from his pocket, then folded it again, without reading. His gray eyes met hers. I have no land to give you that you don't already walk upon. No gold, no name to open doors. But I give you my days, my silence, my storms, my hands, and whatever heart I have left. It's yours, until the last. Evelyn's breath caught, but her smile trembled through tears. I once thought survival was all I could hope for. But you gave me something I never dared ask for: dignity. I promised to keep your fire lit, to guard your name, and to love you in the quiet ways that last. Reverend Matthews raised his voice just enough. Then, by the grace of God and the will of those who stand here, I pronounce you man and wife. No applause followed, just silence full and reverent. Colton leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. Not a kiss for show, but a touch that said, we made it. We're home. Years passed beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The cabin still stood, its timbers grayer, its shutters stronger. Wildflowers blanketed the fields. The apricot tree bloomed pink each spring, and laughter carried farther than any echo of the past. Evelyn sat beneath the tree one warm morning, looping yarn into a tiny sweater, a cradle carved with daisies and hearts beside her. Sawyer had spent nights in the barn, shaping it by hand, while she sewed and sang softly to the child stirring in her belly. Their 3-year-old son now tumbled in the grass, curls wild as giggles chasing after a flock of hens. Colton came from the barn with dust on his shirt, a faint scratch on his cheek, and pride in his step. He lifted the boy into his arms, who promptly fell asleep against his shoulder. Evelyn looked up at him, eyes warm, and rested her palm on the curve of her belly. I used to think, she whispered, that home wasn't meant for me, that I'd always be running or hiding, that surviving was all I'd ever do. Colton knelt beside her, pressing one calloused hand gently over her stomach. You gave this place meaning. You made it a home worth staying in. Their foreheads touched. No promises were needed anymore. Each sunrise, each shared meal, each laugh of their son was vow enough. From the porch, the smell of baking bread drifted on the breeze. The same recipe Evelyn once learned in the hardest winter of her life now filled the air with warmth. A wooden sign hung above the cabin door, its letters smoothed by wind and rain. Where bread was offered, a family was born. Evelyn once believed her worth had been stolen by betrayal, by hunger, by the cold sneers of strangers. But love is not found in wealth or in chains. It is built in small mercies, in steadfast presence, in choosing each other day after day. Her story is a reminder, no matter what accusations the world hurls at you, your true worth shines through the hands you hold, the fires you tend, and the love you refuse to give up on. If this tale stirred something in you, if you believe that love is stronger than shame, that second chances matter, drop a comment below. Tell us the moment that struck you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West love stories where hearts beat louder than gunfire, and every ending is a choice, not a chain. Because out here under the open sky, home isn't a place you find. It's the people who choose you back.